G'day. I'm going to talk to you today about two typefaces I released earlier this year, Untitled Sans and Untitled Serif. This is Untitled Sans. Now I want you to remember that feeling that you have right now as you're looking at it and you can't distinguish any kind of qualities or style or feeling or anything. I want you to hold on to that feeling until the end. So this was designed over a period of several years and started with conversations I had with my good designer friend Duncan about what would constitute the ideal sans serif for his work. And I started by chopping bits off National, another one of my typefaces. And it didn't really become anything and I just sort of abandoned it. And so a few years later I started redrawing it in this no-mind kind of manner, in a similar way where you drive a car for a very long time, you're just automatic and you're not even thinking about it. And it just sort of ended up like this. And I wasn't convinced it was a valid typeface, mainly because it's sort of generic and most of my typefaces have quite a lot of my personality and hand in them. And this had nothing of me in it. And it was actually quite terrifying to see this emerge from my unconscious, because look at it. This is what my lizard brain wants to do. Fuck. So what actually convinced me that it was valid was a project by the two industrial designers, Jasper Morrison and Naoto Fukasawa. That was their Supernormal project. Now the full title of this project was Supernormal, Sensations of the Ordinary. And it was a celebration of, quotidian, everyday objects that we take for granted. And these are objects that have transcended, or what they say, normality into the supernormal. And there's nothing that could be added or subtracted to their design. Their form has basically been perfected over time and many hands working on them. And so the best way to sum up their philosophy is two quotes. And so I'm going to read from the slides. That's sort of, never do that in a presentation, but I'm going to do it. And Morrison says, there are better ways to design than putting a lot of effort into making something look special. Special is generally less useful than normal and less rewarding in the long term. Special things demand attention for the wrong reasons, interrupting potentially good atmosphere with their awkward presence. And Fukasawa, he says, designers generally do not think to design the ordinary. If anything, they live in fear of people saying their designs are nothing special. And of course, undeniably, people do have an unconscious, everyday sense of normal. But rather than try and blend in, the tendency is for designers to create statement or stimulation. So, normal has come to mean unstimulating or boring design. And this was quite a revelation for me, that they had taken this as a concept for forming an exhibition. And it was this project and philosophy that helped me understand and accept what other designers were saying about Untitled Sans, that there was that an unassuming and ordinary typeface is perfectly valid. And so once I had accepted that a no design approach was valid, I applied it to a serif typeface, because serifs are my first love. And that feeling again you're getting right now when you're trying to ascertain some sort of nice detail or something a little bit zhuzhy about it. It's just not there. But this was more like my normal approach to design. So I was researching and cross-referencing and basically stealing from all the old dead guys. And these typefaces was what's known as the old style typefaces, not the French Renaissance stuff, but the typefaces that's sort of post-Canon and pre-Times. They're just sort of ordinary, everyday sans serifs. And so in order to remove myself from these, I became the reader. I created endless ebooks with the latest version of this font, and I read them on my iPad. And any detail that stood out as being not normal, I just got rid of it. And so these two typefaces were largely focused on removing myself from the letter forms. Untitled Sans was a no-mind removal. It was an unconscious and automatic approach. And Untitled Serif was a mindful removal, a conscious approach to normality. And Sans needed the external validation from the ideas of somebody else's project, Supernormal. And Untitled Serif needed internal validation from me via rigorous testing. But mainly, and this is the main sort of issues that this project threw up for me, it was they both needed to be validated because I didn't never start with a clear purpose or a brief for this work. It just evolved naturally as I went along, and it's taken me quite a while to understand that this is just how I work. And my typefaces are always just sort of the endpoints of some sort of curious exploration, and I just have a vague idea or impulse, and I just pull the threads to see if it works. And it's caused me quite a lot of guilt over the years because my process isn't design, and because the dominant narrative of the design process is working from a clear problem to a clear solution. And if that's the dominant narrative in graphic design, the other's, creating solutions for problems. In the type design world, it's typefaces are tools. And I want to look at these two ideas, that solutions and tools, a little bit closer in terms of typeface design. And it's quite hard to articulate exactly what problems typefaces are solving these days. And I'd argue that almost every typographic problem is largely a technical and not an aesthetic problem, i.e. the technical aspects of a typographic problem can be solved rather than the shape of the typeface itself. For example, better inks and better alloys and better paper allowed for better printing in the old metal days. Every letter form adjustment to counteract the medium can be solved by improving the medium. So for me, ink traps these days are now virtually redundant for printing. Hinting, the process of grid fitting fonts for small screen sizes, becomes redundant as resolution improves. Optical sizing, which is the idea of having fonts made specifically for small and large sizes, doesn't solve a problem as such, but it used to simply work with just the raw mechanics of human vision. There was once a one-to-one relationship between cutting the metal and the size, but technology introduced the scalable master, and misuse of this introduced a new problem, i.e. using one master incorrectly. And font file size has reared its ugly head again now, especially web fonts. And Matthew Carter tells a story where he once tried to keep the font file size down by drawing efficient outlines in his charter typeface. And when he proudly told the head of engineering at Bitstream about it, the engineer said, "Nah, mate, we don't have a problem with that any longer. We just have more compact algorithms." And so he was left with a design solution to a non-existent technical problem. And happily, thanks to the hard work of clever people, most of whom are in this room, the small file size of web fonts is getting extremely small and efficient. And so this isn't really things that I do. I'm not a technical person. And if a problem has already been solved, does it count as being solved over and over and over again? So for example, once the concept of ink traps was discovered, once that specific form was used to solve a technical problem, does it count if I use that idea again? And if I do use it, am I solving a problem, or am I simply reusing a known and established technique? And what's interesting about ink traps, for instance, is why they're used now for display purposes for large typography. So our supposedly typefaces tools are starting to use functional properties for purely aesthetic purposes. Which brings me to the idea of a typeface as a tool, which is related to the problem-solving aspect. So a typeface as a tool is kind of a reassuring, practical-sounding rationalization for making new typefaces, because nobody can argue with the idea of a tool, because it's intrinsically linked with our development as a species. Tools, language, and abstract thought is basically what makes us human. And the pragmatic implications are deep-rooted, because the idea of a tool plays nicely into the established craft history of type founding. But I'm sort of a little bit unsure of this idea as well, because what exactly is a typeface a tool for? And if you leave aside the dictionary definitions of physical hand tools like hammers and screwdrivers, the simplest one is a thing used to help perform a job. And so this is quite a reassuringly broad definition, and almost anything can be defined as a tool. And so it leads you to ask, what job is it performing? And at its most pragmatic level, a font makes language visible. These tools turn verbal language into images that we suck into our brains through our eyeballs. And so this functional aspect is performed adequately by virtually all typefaces, and is at the root of the perennial question, why do we need new typefaces? Which I think is another way of saying, why do we need new tools for performing the same old job? Because in the design world, we could functionally perform all our typesetting jobs, 1 or 2 typefaces. So you know this is true, and if you think of your last 5 design jobs and try to imagine why you couldn't just use Times or Helvetica, the Whitney notwithstanding. You know, you absolutely could have, and perhaps Vignelli was right all along, but why didn't you? And I can almost guarantee it's because you didn't. It was for purely aesthetic reasons. You didn't choose those typefaces. You chose new ones because of how they look and how they felt, and you chose it because of the aesthetic. And so today, these days, I argue that the function of a typeface is largely aesthetic because our tools are absolutely image-based. They perform an aesthetic job. They communicate visually and culturally, and we crave new letter forms. We find them fascinating. We find them repulsive and intoxicating. And to say a typeface is a tool isn't necessarily a statement of fact or a logical truism. It's more of a signal of a philosophical intent by the designer. In the same way, when Le Corbusier said, "A house is a machine for living," it's to be understood as a statement of his particular sort of philosophy of architecture. And so to say a typeface is a tool is like saying it's beautifully engineered or lovingly handcrafted and it's legible and readable. And it's essentially saying this font is well made. But it implies hand manufacture, and it does invoke all these manual physical processes of the old days. And so if the primary problem of typeface design is to make legible and readable letter forms, to find a physical form for the alphabet, then the problem has been solved thousands and thousands of times over, almost weekly. However, from my point of view, there's no definitive form of the alphabet. And to think that we've solved the problem of typeface design is to assume that the alphabet has been solved, that all its forms have been discovered. But the alphabet is not a problem to be solved by a single typeface. It's a concept, and it's made concrete through countless written and designed letter forms. And the alphabet isn't defined by a single typeface, but it's expressed through all of them. And so what we're doing is we're chasing Plato's elusive forms, and we're trying to nail the shadows to the wall of his cave. And I think we'd be much happier, a bit more relaxed, if we got rid of the whole problem-solving mindset and framing of our work, because I certainly am. And the problems have already been solved, and it's quite a relief, because artists don't worry about it, and musicians don't worry about it, and chefs don't worry about it, and authors don't worry about it, and I don't think we should either. And I think we should just embrace the pure aesthetic nature of our work. And so a typeface designer's first problem is drawing new letters. And then once that's done, the second problem kicks in, selling the new letters. And because remember, a type foundry exists to do 2 things only: make fonts and sell fonts. So this brings me to the marketing of Untitled Sans and Serif. And font naming is hard. Every type designer will moan about it at least once a week on Twitter. But the first thing you need to sell a typeface is the name. And naming a typeface is a relatively new phenomenon. Once they were simply designated by size, and then genre, and then finally they were named abstractly and conceptually. And there's a really good sort of write-up on this on Tobias Freer-Jones's blog, if you want to tick that up later on, or read it now. And titling is a relatively new phenomenon with art as well, because before artwork circulated, there was the shared understanding in a community as to what the work symbolized. The name or a title was relatively redundant. But when art started to travel between communities and countries and languages, naming became quite important. And eventually, now, these days, we understand that a title of a painting will implicitly shape our interpretation and understanding of it. And so, unlike the referential problems framed by Magritte's famous The Treachery of Images, or known as This Is Not a Pipe, typefaces are perfectly self-referential, and they're probably the only products that can simultaneously name themselves while showing themselves. They are exactly what they are. And this is font marketing 101. The name of the typeface set in the typeface. And font naming is partly practical, because font files need something in the name tables to function on your computer, but it's mostly marketing, because fonts are sort of like brands, and it's this brand that we buy into. And it's not simply the letter forms that we now respond to, it's the supporting story and the concept that resonates. Because when you use a typeface, you're also using the story associated with it. So when you use Helvetica, you're using 65 years, more or less, of history and mythology and story. And so we avoided the problem of naming altogether by simply leaving them Untitled Sans and Untitled Serif. And don't consider them to be named. They're quite literally untitled. And it's the same way as an untitled artwork simultaneously defies and reinforces the convention of a label. And we've got names in the name tables, the font menus, but only in the same way that an artwork has untitled in the accompanying label. And so the marketing for Untitled Sans and Serif plays on the self-referential concept, the inherent tautological nature of typeface naming. Now, tautology in logic and linguistics is a statement of fundamental fact or truth which is unchangeable and irreversible. And you can see this idea executed kind of brilliantly in the work of Joseph Kosuth, an American artist, 5 words in blue neon. And for these sorts of works that he did in the 60s, the idea is considered more important and fundamental than how it looks. And this work, comprising only of the words of the title, constructed in blue neon tubing, makes language its content by sort of collapsing the description and the image into each other. It references only itself. And so, Kosuth's attempts to take himself out of the aesthetic, out of the work, echoed my own attempts with Untitled Sans and Serif, and the marketing, therefore, was a logical continuation of this. And so here were the essential criteria for the Untitled Sans and Serif marketing. It should reference only itself. We should remove all personal emotion. We should strip it back to essentials, reduce to information, and create specific to format. And if type was the figure, then neutral grey was to be the ground. So in the beginning is the tweet, like there always is. Untitled Sans and Serif have their own Twitter accounts. They have all the essentials there. They have a link, a URL to their own websites. They only follow each other, and they only tweeted once. And they tweeted to their Instagram account. And so, here's the Untitled Sans Insta and the Untitled Serif Insta. But the natural format of Instagram is the cell phone with its front-facing camera. And the natural content of Instagram are selfies. There's an inherent sort of vain undertones to this medium. And so the Untitled Sans and Serif Instagram accounts are just full of selfies. It's an entire type specimen selfie. They follow only each other. They have a hashtag, Untitled Sans or Untitled Serif, and they're chocker full of it. And they have only posted everything once, and that's it, no more. And we did the same with the serif. So every single style and weight for every single letter is in that account. In the printed world, we just ran very quotidian looking ads, which referenced the website. And here is the website for Untitled Sans, a little bit of a scroll. And here's the website for Untitled Serif, soon. And so these websites reflect the two fundamental aspects of the medium of the web, which is the scroll and the link. Scrolling changes the point size and is reflected in the type. And the type is also a link to Klim where you can buy the fonts because it's a .com commercial. This is the other underlying aspect of the web. Every time we made a specimen image, it referenced itself. What was it? A JPEG. What is it? Untitled Sans JPEG. Untitled Serif JPEG. On my blog, Untitled Sans.ping. Untitled Serif.ping. And these were the only specimen images, consider specimen images, that we ever made. The animated GIF. It was not all dry, is it? That's quite funny. I thought it was. And in the physical world, we work with the A formats in New Zealand, like Europe as well. And so these two badges, the titles, which are in your goodie bags there, individually handcrafted. Enamel pins, quite good actually. They're mounted on the A5 card. The A4 is the specimen. And the A3, A2, A1, and A0 are sort of limited screen edition, silk screened prints. that we sent free to people who purchased the entire family. And so we basically covered the entire A range specific to format. And so I didn't actually know how to end this talk. That was as far as I got. So what I'm going to go with is, now that I'm a new father and I don't get a lot of sleep, one night I was wandering around the house and I was sort of in the middle of the night and I caught my sort of reflection in the mirror, and the lighting was weird and it was sort of backlit and all I could see was my silhouette. I couldn't see my face. And I sat there looking at it and I tried to imagine what my face looked like, and I couldn't. I couldn't imagine it. I couldn't see my face. And I imagined this would be quite terrifying, but it wasn't. It was really quite calming and it was a very nice meditative experience. And that's sort of a really nice metaphor for what I was trying to do with Untitled Sans and Serif, is just remove myself from it so it can just be like this normal, useful thing that doesn't ruin the atmosphere. That'd be that. Thank you very much.